Good evening. Hello. Hi. Welcome to the first of the Park Avenue Armory's Malkin Lecture Series for 2024. I'm Kirsten Riak. I am the guest curator this year of the Malkin Lecture Series after being here with the Armory for 20 years. I have moved on, but I come back for this because I love it so much. When the 7th Regiment of the New York National Guard began their search for a strategic and desirable location to move uptown from the becoming seedy Lower East Side where they had been, their first preference was for a location on Fifth Avenue at this street corner of 5th and 42nd. They thought, hey, there's a reservoir, we don't use it. Now this is our spot for our new armory. That could have been this down there. Lo and behold, the neighbors said that it would be loud and it would draw traffic. In the early 1870s, already NIMBYism was a New York skill. And so we sit here on the less preferable 4th Avenue, as it was called then, and 5th Avenue got a grand library instead. I am sure that drew no traffic at all. So 5th Avenue has long been such a desirable location and a place of constant transformation with lots of style and panache. And tonight we welcome Mosette Broderick to take us through on a journey along the avenue's history, from brownstone row houses to grand mansions, civic institutions, shopping meccas, and soaring skyscrapers. Ms. Broderick is a clinical professor in the Department of Art History at New York University and the director of the London MA program in Historical and Sustainable Architecture. Professor Broderick's many publications include the Villard Houses, Life Story of a Landmark, and I just want to say that when I began working on the Armory project, back when we didn't have the building, I think that was 1999. It actually, we were in that house because Municipal Art Society was there. Yeah, so many connections. And she also wrote Triumvirate, McKim, Mead, and White, Architecture, Scandal, and Class in America's Gilded Age. And with that, we welcome her to this Gilded Age landmark. Mosette?
Oh, goodness. I'm deeply grateful to everybody here. It's been a pleasure to work with you all. Oscar and Kristen have just been marvelous. It's a pleasure to see you all and to be in a room that I consider the most beautiful room in New York City. We can never really appreciate enough the early days of Stanford White's design with the other great artists of Associated Artists, which are preserved here and almost nowhere else. This is a splendid example of high style for that time period, a style that's been annihilated virtually everywhere we go. So enjoy your surroundings while we talk a little bit about New York in the early days. So what was New York like in its earliest days? Slow and sleepy. What is it like today? Speed and greed. We move very quickly, everything's about money, and that all begins in the early 19th century, and Fifth Avenue becomes the road that lets it happen. Fifth Avenue was the magnet that pulled New York City to the north, pulling up a block a year from Washington Square all the way to the 90s. The buildings on Fifth Avenue were originally brownstones, then later grander houses, but the rich pulled the city northward on Fifth Avenue while the middle-class speculative builders went out beyond the Fifth Avenue, Sixth Avenue, or Madison Avenue area and built the middle-class housing. And the poor housing went all the way to the edge of those streets. So Fifth Avenue was the magnet that pulled New York to the top. It's also a peculiar street where the change in New York society happens in a very short period of time. The average life of a row house in New York City's Fifth Avenue was 20 years. Everything moved so fast that within 20 years you were out of style, you were too far downtown, and you went and leaped up. New York City in the early days was a city of conformity. Now, let me see. Oh, there we are. Let me see. I'm always bad with these things. Oops, I've got it upside down, maybe. There we go. Thanks. I hate technology, and it hates me. Okay, so New York City is, at this point, a rather small entity of Dutch and English families. The Dutch owned the land, the English brought in business. And they lived in a very bizarre, so I hope this stays together, they lived in a very similar fashion. There weren't very many of them, and their employment had to do with the port. Everybody was a merchant of the port or somebody who in the port did ship's chandlering and that sort of thing. It was all about boats and about trade. And maybe there were 50 families, some of them of Dutch origins, some of them joined by New England Yankees. New England had a little problem. Everything froze. New York Harbor, as you all know, didn't. And so a lot of the New England Yankee people in the shipping businesses, in the boat businesses, came down to New York City and joined the Dutch. And the Dutch won, interestingly enough. Although the Dutch customs and ceremonies were adhered to by the English, the churches went over to the Brits. St. Mark's in the Bowery, the venerable Dutch church, had a fire in 1799, and Trinity Church Wall Street bought it. So very quickly, the British are in command, but the customs become those of the group of people we call the Knickerbockers. And they had very simple, very charming customs. They didn't do Christmas, they did New Year's. And what they did at New Year's was all the ladies in the houses would make a punch, a strong alcohol punch. And all the gentlemen would come in bands and drink a cup of the punch and then go to another house. They must have been smashed by the end of the day. But this was an ancient custom. They didn't do much in the way of cooking. Ginger snaps were the favorite treat. At night, the young people who were looking for perhaps some social life didn't go to parties. They didn't go to any. They went down and danced at the edges of Washington Square Park or City Hall Park. Maybe they talked on the stoop of the house. It was a simple world, a world of conformity. Everybody had the same house, had the same customs, wore the same clothes. Everybody did everything the same way. When they went shopping for something for the new house, everybody went to the same seller. So we're talking about a simple time, a rather primitive time by New York City standards, and a time which is going to get really smashed very quickly in the middle of the 19th century. Okay. So here we are. I love this. This is Washington Square Parade Ground, as you all know. I always call it Washington Rectangle, but I've had it confirmed that this is the 7th Regiment Armory. I love it because it looks like everybody is out in a test run for the Nutcracker at Christmas. But this must have been just about all the people who were of any importance in the small society of the time. You see in the far distance the Dutch church at Washington Square. Where did they live? They lived in similar red brick houses, something like this. The houses were of a modest sort, and the interiors, as I just mentioned, would have all been exactly alike. The transition comes with this set of houses, still partially with us, at the north of Washington Square. This is the Row, a wonderful set of 13 houses that go from from University Place straight across to Fifth Avenue. They merge a new style. The Greek Revival is coming in. Those little porches and the even roof line change a little bit, but they're still red brick houses. They're just a little better, a little finer, a little better brickwork. And so this sets up the new group of people who are coming into the city. And this includes the Scottish businessmen. So now we've got Knickerbockers who've absorbed the Yankees and the Scots, and they got along pretty darn well. We're now going to turn the corner. Oh, sorry, I went too fast. We're going to turn the corner, and we're going to wonder why in the world Fifth Avenue became the street of transaction, and Second Avenue, an equal street, a street that already had the Dutch presence, where already the grander people in the Dutch world lived on Second Avenue, Stuyvesant, all those connections. Why didn't they go up on Second Avenue? Second Avenue had a rock base, so it's perfectly sturdy, 100 feet width. So did Fifth Avenue. Why did they go over to Fifth? I think it had to do with real estate speculation of the day. Second Avenue was still partially owned, or greatly owned, by the Stuyvesant Rutherfords and the old Dutch the old Dutch patroon families. Fifth Avenue only had a brief bit of real estate property owned by the Dutch, and that's Henry Brevoort. And this is what he did, and that is to create an anchor house. We're going to see several anchor houses now. He turned the corner, and just as he turned the corner, he built a house by the very best architect. He was very smart. He went and got the very best architect of the day, and this house was going to sell his property to other people. He owned only a little bit of property, not like the Stuyvesants and Rutherfords. So other speculators could come in and build above him, and I think that was the opening up of Fifth Avenue, the fact there was freedom to build above it. What did Brevoort do? This particularly splendid house by A.J. Davis, a house that lived almost 100 years. What he did was abide by a new rule which had come in for Lafayette Place, for Lafayette Row, and that was to allow gardens and greenery and to have a little space between the houses for a little bit of gardening, a little bit of greenery, a little bit of wonder in the good months of the year. And so you could see the houses have little openings around them, and that made Fifth Avenue below 12th Street really a very special place that almost allowed it to be reborn in the 1920s, but it didn't quite work. Okay. Now, just as that turn in the corner was made, two things happened that had nothing to do with Fifth Avenue or the story. That is the inauguration and then absolute addiction of New York City to brownstone. The material from Belleville, New Jersey, easily pushed across the harbor, easy to work with, and creating the years that were written about later as the brownstone decades. So not only was the material new, but the style was new. All of a sudden, right here, coincidentally, the style of the West Development areas in London, the Renaissance Palace style as adapted to row houses came in. So here we are at 8th Street and 5th Avenue, and what we're seeing here is a house that is now both brownstone and also in this new Renaissance style, which will become the ubiquitous brownstone you and I always know existed in New York. And we can see it here. What we're looking at in this long shot view is a sign of the two approved religious structures for the people now living on Lower Fifth Avenue and around Washington Square, the Presbyterian and the Episcopal churches, both of which on 11th and 12th Street are still there. Okay, this is the house on 10th Street that was a very interesting house for its day. It was a textile owner from New Orleans who built a house with a doorway in the middle and the mansard roof. It was said to have hot and cold running water. It was the first really grand house built, but poor old Hart Schiff, who built it, died before he could move into it. So this house, although it lived a long time for Amos Eno, the great print collector, it was a special house for its period. Up on 12th Street, we see something really weird, and this has to do with those Scottish people. This is Mr. Lennox's house. Old man Robert Lennox came from Scotland in the middle of the 18th century and did one superbly wise move. He bought a huge property on 70th Street to 73rd Street from 5th Avenue going east. It is the area you all know, not far from us here, called Lenox Hill. And one of the things Mr. Lennox said to his rather reclusive scholarly son is, don't sell that land. Now, what did the younger Lennox do? Well, he had a great interest in Scottish novels. I guess that explains the house. This is a brownstone house with crenellations. It's the only one like it. Why in the world he built that? But I guess it's the Walter Scott fever. What Lennox did, Lennox the younger was a single man, although his sister had the house next door. But he only communicated with his family and a few servants, but he collected books and collected intellectual apparatus. And it was all in that house where he lived with a trusted servant, and nobody was ever allowed to meet him in there. But as he began to think about his death, he began to think about where that could go, and that's why he created the Lennox Library, which we will see later. Now, Lennox probably based the house on this. This is the old NYU, University of the City of New York building down at Washington Square by James Dakin, who was a partner at that point in the Davis firm. So I think he had him do the house, but it's very difficult to understand. Okay, now this is the man who starts the motion to change the city. This is August Belmont, who comes over to New York in 1837 on his way to Cuba to work for the Rothschilds. He gets off the boat, smells the activity in New York City's financial era, even though it was a bad economic time. And Belmont said, I'm not going to Cuba, I'm staying here. And he worked out a deal with the Rothschilds to represent them here, which he would do, but also have his own business. And he becomes, as that wonderful book tells us, the king of Fifth Avenue. He built himself a very grand house on 18th Street. This is it. I've never been able to, it's an English architect, the highest skilled, the most skilled architect of this time period, Frederick Diaper. Why it's a double house, I don't know. Why did it need two entries exactly alike? I don't know. We do know that the first ballroom on Fifth Avenue is the little squat building beyond it. Belmont had great taste in wine, great taste in food, said to have had the first French chef, you know, all that sort of thing, but terrible taste in pictures. So that wasn't always a plus. Belmont did find himself receiving some criticism from the business community, which didn't love him or his connections to the Rothschilds. So Belmont did the most strategic thing he could do in the day. He married an Episcopalian and converted. Not only did he marry an Episcopalian, but he married the daughter of the Perrys, the wonderful Admiralty family from Newport. In fact, her father, this is Tiny Belmont, as she was called, her father was going to open up trade with Japan in just a few years. So Belmont made very good strategic choices. Tiny Belmont was the queen of society at this time. Well-bred, learned, pleasant, everybody liked her. But she retires from society right at the end of the Civil War, probably because her daughter was ailing. Her daughter, indeed, would die fairly quickly. And so she left open the position in New York City society, and we're going to see how that becomes the cutting edge for the changes we're going to see. Okay, we're all the way up to 23rd Street now, and you're looking at the park being laid out at Madison Park, and you're looking at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, a wonderful business a building said to have cost $1 million in the architectural journals of the day. Not true, but it is one of the first grand hotels in America. It had bathrooms. It had a table for lunch where you could, and for meals. You got 4 meals a day, and you could bring your friends. And the concept was a big, long table, so you would meet the other people staying in the hotel. So this is a moment that will change the city, blocking the development of Fifth Avenue at 23rd Street for the hotel business, but also because of this guy. This is another important figure in the early days of New York City. This is a man called Leonard Jerome, and he is said to be a stockbroker, but you and I know he was a gambler. He hit it lucky in 1858, and he managed to build this amazing house, which is the first house that breaks out of that brownstone or red brick mode, and it was a house just crawling in extra iron fronts, mansard roof, a double-headed mansard roof, a huge stable behind it, which is said to have had 2 fountains, one pushed up water, and one pushed up wine, and the other pushed up perfume. So it is said that the horses were better treated than the guests. Indeed, his wife took the 3 daughters and decided this was true, and she goes to France and then to England, and you all may know that the middle daughter, Jenny, marries the younger Churchill and becomes the mother of Winston, who was supposed to, of course, Leonard Jerome was supposed to support them, which he couldn't because he never hit it big again. Clubs. The Jerome House becomes a club. Clubs start here. They start in the brownstones, but the brownstones are too small and too awkward for a club. Where do you put the bathrooms if they're only... A real nightmare. So this is the first purpose-built club in New York City. This is the Union Club. We're looking at 21st Street and Fifth Avenue. It's a building in the manner of the Pall Mall clubs by New York City's brownstone expert, a man called Griffith Thomas. What else did we have here? Restaurants. This is Delmonico's. Delmonico's hops up from Lower Manhattan, goes to 14th Street and then 26th Street. This is 26th Street here, and then to 44th Street. You all will know that that's where you would have gatherings. That's where you would have a ball in the early days in Delmonico's, but it was a men's restaurant. Women could not eat on their own here. They had to be brought by a man. This is 37th Street now. We're looking at how the brownstones just crawl up the avenue, absolutely alike. Everyone. It is said that if you had too much to drink and you went up the stairs of one of those houses and knocked on the mahogany door and looked and tried to turn the silver door handle and the silver details on the door, the person who greeted you there would say, "No, you live next door." So there is a similarity in everything they do. Here we're looking up at that same area. Now, who's going to take society to a new path? And it is often said it is this woman. This is Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, a woman who is a Schermerhorn, which means part of that Dutch group. In fact, she becomes really at her death. If the Schermerhorns had held onto their property, they owned so much real estate in New York and the city moved so fast, she would have been the rich one, not the Astors. She made a very bad marriage to the second Astor son. It was an unhappy marriage, would remain unhappy. She was quickly abandoned by Mr. Astor, who took up with boats, women, and booze. And so she is kind of left alone, and she will be brought out as the vehicle for creating a new social order from her house here on 34th Street. This is an anchor house. Like the Brevorts, the Astors built anchor houses at the 33rd and 34th Street site to literally anchor all the rest of the houses down the street are rental units. So if you're going to rent one of the houses, well, I'm right next to Mrs. Astor. So the Astors sort of presented their children as an anchor to the real estate community, and this is her house. She was pretty unhappy a few years later when a man called Thomas Sarsaparilla Townsend bought the house and bought the property across the street from her. They didn't own the property on 34th Street at this point. So here we see Sarsaparilla Thompson's house, and she must have gagged when she saw that. But luckily for her, Sarsaparilla went bad, and he sold the property to A.T. Stewart, the department store magnate and large real estate owner, and a man with a shady reputation. At the time, you all may remember, he was said to be the first Minister of the Treasury for General Grant, and by the next morning had to retract himself. So this was a problem. He came from Northern Ireland and had a little store, but it was really real estate that propelled him. And he builds this amazing house. If any of you know the current Department of Education, the old Tweed Courthouse in Lower Manhattan, it's the same guy. Huge, thick walls of marble from his Tuckahoe quarry. He built this wonderful house on the corner of 5th and 34th Street for himself and his well-born, but probably pretty quiet wife. They did not have surviving children. They had 2 or 3 children who died in infancy, and so this is a house for 2 people. What in the world's that about? Fifth Avenue was the major street. Here we see General Grant's funeral. It's marching up. There's the other Astor family house with the black drapery, and then the garden in between, and then Mrs. Schermerhorn Astor's house there. So we see how the buildings were used in the day. Mrs. Astor said that she would never do anything but buy rugs for Mr. Stewart's store, but would never have him over to walk upon them. So what in the world did he do this house for? His wife was actually, I always puzzle over this, because clearly his wife would have known Mrs. Astor. They would have grown up in the same world, the old merchants of the port world. But I think she was pretty much out of the picture all along. So what did he build this house for? Why did he do that? Maybe for this. Unlike Mr. Belmont, Mr. Stewart had a very good eye. And he bought pictures, and he bought sculpture, and he bought American stuff too, which was novel in that many of the grander houses did not have any American work at all. He really chose well. My thinking was that he considered at the time of his elder age that he would give maybe his house and the pictures to the city to create our first museum, because we hadn't quite gotten ready for the Metropolitan's first days yet at this time. It didn't happen. But they are very wonderful pictures. And here's Caroline Schermerhorn Astor in her Carolus Duran portrait. And what she is bored. She's had children. They've grown up. The husband's out in the water. She doesn't quite know what to do, and she runs into this guy. This guy is Ward McAllister. a kind of sleazy social climber of this time period who needs to create a society where he can sort of profit and sort of call the shots, which is what he thinks he has to do because he's extremely pretentious. And he needs a figurehead, though. He's not rich himself anymore, and he doesn't have any New York City clout. He's from Savannah. So what he does is latch on to poor old sallow-faced Mrs. Astor, and they create the Patriarchs, New York City's most exclusive and first big social entity, which was very good at keeping people out. And here we see a wonderful, this is a terrific cartoon of the day. There's McAllister with ass's ears, pointing to how you should look if you're a proper gentleman in his eyes, to Uncle Sam, who is laughing hysterically at the picture. So Mrs. Astor's here, Mr. Stewart's here. Mr. Stewart is not invited to the Patriarchs, but how are we going to get the people who are coming to New York now with big money, and oddly enough, women push their way in? This is Minnie Stevens, Mrs. Perrin Stevens, over here on the right, and what she does is force New York City to accept her. Wasn't easy. She did it via her daughter, who we see here, who had green eyes and not a very great personality. Mrs. Stevens went to Europe with green-eyed Minnie, and what she did was trot her around to available ex-counts, out-of-work English noblemen, etc., and claim huge money in the United States, which she didn't have. In fact, one French duke came over, sent somebody over, and found out how fictional her wealth was. But she finally does manage to marry Minnie off to a minor British aristocrat, and that was what allowed her to become Queen Elizabeth I, as you see it here, as she got dressed for one of those wonderful balls that come back at this time period. Now, here we are talking about the street corner that you were speaking about a minute ago. This is the Croton Reservoir, and here we are looking down from the Croton Reservoir now, and we're seeing again how similar, how everything is exactly the same. And here we're looking at people going to a funeral in front of the Croton distribution tank, and here we see this I love, this is the beginning of the Easter Parade. And notice the city is moving up because they're moving northward on Fifth Avenue now, northward towards 42nd Street. There we go. And this is what we see. This is New York below. And at 42nd Street, we're going to see, we still have a little bit of this, the New York we expect, but we're beginning to change a little bit. We're moving up to 47th Street, and this is the house of one of the most unpleasant of the robber barons, the scourge of Wall Street. This is his house, all draped in extra detail so that it can become the house of the new moneyed robber barons of the day. We're moving up again, and now we see another anchor house. We're coming to another anchor house. So between 42nd Street and this, we're at about 55th Street now, and we're looking north. And as we look at Madison Avenue and 55th Street and see how high it is on the created roadbed compared to the sides where you see the rocks and the squalor and the regular, that's what the land was like around here even in the middle of the 1850s. What we're looking at is the creation of the other anchor house of Mary Mason Jones, a person. There we go. It's this complex. Mary Mason Jones was a member of the old Knickerbocker Society, a very important one. Her father had some very great wisdom, rather the way Mr. Lennox had. In the early 1820s, he had bought a farm from Mr. Buchanan. The farm is what we call basically today Midtown. So the Mason family had 3 daughters. 2 of them are surviving now. And what they decide to do is build themselves houses way up at the top of their property. The minute Fifth Avenue is laid out, we saw it being laid out in the last slide, it's laid out, and they built a house there, and the houses were to rent out other houses on their property, which she did. The houses behind the corner house are actually rental houses. And she then employs her architect to go down the streets. So her being there full-time as a presence, watching from her corner window there, the city below, as it came closer and closer to visit her, going past the goats, going back past the shacks, going past the places that sold cigars and seltzer water to come to visit her. She was a corpulent woman. She figures greatly in Edith Wharton's stories. You all may know her as Mrs. Mingott. She lived in this house for a very long time. She and Mrs. Scribnerhorn Astor used to go. They were part of what they called the Faubourg Saint-Honoré set, and they would go to Paris every spring. So you can see the influence of Paris in the design for this house. The house, curiously enough, was built by Mr. Mook, who was an architect, self-proclaimed architect, but curiously enough, his father was the owner of the slaughterhouse on 44th Street that did all the meat for New York City through the middle of the century. Okay, this is her sister's house. She did the same thing in 55th Street. She lived in the corner house too, and she rented her house too. So they sort of allowed the city to fill in between 42nd Street and their houses in the 50s as New York City moved to the north. Okay, now we've gone up to 54th Street, and what you're looking at on the right is St. Luke's Hospital in its first incarnation. And what you're looking at on the left is a peculiar house built in 1865 by a Mr. Williams, and no one knows why. This is the house. It's a brownstone with sets of windows. Windows on all four sides, with a little gazebo and garden there, and a little stable to the Fifth Avenue portion of the property. And New York City is deep in the background. That's 42nd Street, way down below it. So it's in the middle of nowhere. And why Mr. Williams built this house, I don't know. But in the early 1870s, it goes over to a very wonderful woman, a self-creation called Arabella Worsham, who moves up here with her young son. You know the story. Allegedly with her late husband's son, Worsham. She was, of course, the mistress of Collis P. Huntington, who had a very inconvenient wife. So what Mr. Huntington did is put them in, although she actually bought the house. There's some real estate funniness in here. But in any case, she lived in this house and nobody lived here. So if he went to visit her and the son, nobody would see him because nobody lived up here. So she had this wonderful house for a couple of years, and in it she will, I'm going to go back to that in a minute, in it she will create the other great room of this time period, which is now in the Brooklyn Museum. This is Arabella's smoking room from the 54th Street house. Thank goodness it's still there. It's a really beautiful house. Arabella had really good taste. If anybody knows the Huntington Library in Pasadena, that's Arabella. She really had very good taste in everything she did. In 1880, she had a bit of luck. Mrs. Huntington died. That meant that Mr. Huntington could marry her and legalize the son, who was probably his son all along anyway. And at that point, he builds her a big house on the site of Tiffany's, modern Tiffany's store today. And she passes this house on to the Rockefellers. And what I've never understood, it remained in the Rockefeller hands for a very long time. In 1925, when Mrs. Elder Rockefeller's wife died, they abandoned the house. And then with the custom that the Rockefellers always had, at his death, all his houses were to be demolished. And so it was demolished. But luckily, some of the rooms were taken out, as the smoking room we just saw. What I don't understand about this is Rockefeller was a hard-shell Baptist. Didn't want his son to go to Yale or Harvard because he'd meet people who smoked and drank and danced, all of which was appalling to him. He bought the house of a known kept woman with an illegitimate child and didn't do a thing to the interior, never changed an iota of the interior. You figure that one out. I couldn't either. All right, we're going up Fifth Avenue now. That's St. Pat's on the right. And then all of a sudden we run into a farm. What? A farm? Why is it still here? And the farm is going to be bought out by William Henry Vanderbilt, the son of the Commodore. And the reason the farm is still here is it's across the street from Madame Restell. My friend over here may know who Madame Restell is. No, she was society's abortionist. So nobody wanted to be across the street from her. She had a residential program. So Vanderbilt buys the house and builds what will become Vanderbilt Alley. Here we see him in his house on 40th Street with his grown children. He and his wife really were not that interested in society, but the children were. And so here you see them on 40th Street getting ready to go to the opera, and this is what they do. They create Vanderbilt Alley. And this is a huge double house, later triple house, for Mr. Vanderbilt and his two daughters who married during the process. And this becomes the height of grandeur and the height of the palaces. And all of a sudden, all that convention, everything's the same. No! Now all of a sudden, everybody's standing out. They're doing different things. We're trying to show we're part of European bureaucracy. We are bringing over grand things from our family homes in Europe that don't exist. But what we're doing is trying to be different now and showy and make our way into the new society that Ward McAllister is creating. This is her daughter, this is the Astor daughter-in-law, Alva Smith Vanderbilt Belmont, a very famous character of the day who builds this first white house in a chateau style, beached as it was on Fifth Avenue. Okay, she keeps going the tradition that had briefly been snuffed out, but it's a Victorian tradition. Victoria's court did it, and that is costume parties. So here you see Alva all dressed up as a Venetian princess in a painting by Cabanal, and here is her brother-in-law and sister-in-law. This is Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his wife, who you all may know as Alice of the Breakers. She was in this costume, which included a stanchion with an electric light bulb. She is the Statue of Liberty here and the bringer of electricity to New York. So they bring to the city a wonderful new, there we go. Okay. Alva has a daughter, she has two sons, but oopsie. All right. One of the big problems for people who didn't quite make it is to believe that the goings-on of the patriarchs and the parties in these houses were so wonderful that surely anybody who could afford to do it should be able to join, and we know they didn't. So here's this wonderful Charles Dana Gibson cartoon, which shows this woman trying to pickaxe her way into the party that you see here. Alva had a daughter called Consuela, and you all may know she was groomed by Alva to have a perfect head. She put the poor daughter in a steel contraption for the morning every day so that she would have a swan-like neck, and taught her and had her taught German, French, music. She was an amazingly well-possessed young woman who, with the family's money, could clearly make a very grand marriage, the grandest marriage anybody had made in America. And she did. She made a very unhappy marriage to the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He had a girlfriend, she had a boyfriend, they hated each other. Here we see them in a Sargent portrait in Blenheim. She's produced the heir and the spare, and now she's going to go away. The wedding was the event of the year. Everybody was fascinated by it, and what you see here is New York turning out for the wedding. Everybody was there except the Vanderbilts. Alva didn't invite them. They signed the check in the morning, and Vanderbilt's not allowed to come. Instead, what you have here is New York City's interested society followers. We follow, far too much I think, we follow celebrity culture today. They didn't. In this time period, the papers were just filled with her trousseau, with the details of her life. They followed the society girls until Mamie Fish changes this in the early 20th century, and it becomes celebrities. So here we see them just dying to know about the Marlborough family and the grandeur that we have. And here we see the interior of the entranceway to the William Henry House. And this is my favorite. He had it done up in a year or two, including the purchase of a very large sets of pictures for his art collection. This is his Japanese. When you think of Mr. Belmont opening up or Mr. Perry rather, opening up Japan to Japan to the international trade, here's what they thought of it. This is William Henry Astor's attempt to do a room in a Japanese style. It's about as Japanese as I am. The next member of the family, Cornelius, the one whose wife was dressed up as the Statue of Liberty. Here we see his. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. He built a house too. He built a house on 57th Street. There we go, with a side entrance. A few years later, the Vanderbilts and all the other wealthy people at this time, many of the other wealthy people at this time, are going to do so well that he bought out. See the brownstones just next to his house? He's going to buy them out. And he's going to bring the whole house straight through to 58th Street so that it becomes this enormous property just about the time he dies. It is today, of course, Bergdorf Goodman. Not only did the Vanderbilts and the girls, the daughters are here, this is Vanderbilt Alley, but the children of Alva, the son of Alva, decides to extend her petit chateau, which you see here in 1906. Huh? It's already over. Skyscrapers are beginning to be built on the other side of Fifth Avenue, not very tall, but 8 or 9 stories. They're casting shadows in the gardens. It's over. Many of the people have now married into, something like 300 women have married into European families, so the grandchildren are in Europe. So whatever Willie K. Jr. thought when he was building this house, it lasts 15 years. And there's no record of anybody crying when their house went down. No records. Oh, there we go. So this is the house as it's finished. He takes over his mother's house and builds that addition. And here it is, and it's torn down. And in the lifetime of Alva, in the lifetime of just about everybody else, very fast. One family that didn't fit into this are the Roosevelts, old Dutch patroon families, but they made a lot of money in plate glass. And in the interior here, we see the design difference between the Roosevelts, who had Frank Furness in Philadelphia do these wonderful interiors that are now in Sagamore Hill, but they were a little bit different from the Astors, who are building on this empty land that is Fifth Avenue and this lonely house in the middle of the street. I'm worried that I'm going to quickly. We see now the upper part of Fifth Avenue above the park being developed. It's developed with a lot of speculation. And that means that there's a lot of these poster boards or hoardings or whatever you want to call them, because a lot of people buy the property, then maybe I'm not so sure about it, then to develop it. So we end up with these funny moments when you have sort of these gaps, like holes of missing teeth in the story of Fifth Avenue. We even see, as this happens, Mrs. Astor join that route. So here's Mrs. Astor. Her nasty nephew has built the Waldorf across in his father's property. It's the tall building looming over the garden now. What can Mrs. Astor do? Well, she had a vengeance for a while with the Vanderbilts, but she very quickly gave in, hired the Vanderbilt architect, and here is their double house on 66th Street and 5th. This is the later Astor house. Okay, and here's Mrs. Astor's house. Interior, you can see how different the Roosevelts were. Okay, brownstones still go up, lots of hoardings in place. I'm going to quickly go over these. The houses now are striking with their individuality. We see ways of life. We're going to see in a minute a woman driving a little pony cart, and there you go. And going past the wonderful Havemeyer house, which had the magical interior by Tiffany, with the pictures that Mary Cassatt bought for Louisine Hamilton. Havemeyer, this was a really special house. And then we keep going up Fifth Avenue, and here's the Lenox Library. This is where Mr. Lenox put his books. What happened here 30 years later? Frick buys the property, and it becomes the Frick House, later the Frick Museum. So poor Lenox Library, a fine building. This is the house on the cover of the book. This was the most 102 rooms. Interior swimming pool, which is very unusual at this time period. Mr. Clark, a really, really crooked man who was a senator also, that's a surprise, in the copper business. He and his young daughter, he marries, I don't think he married her, but there is a daughter, Hu Shui. And do you all remember a couple of years ago, there was a 103-year-old woman who died in Beth Israel Hospital who never was sick with her doll collection? That's the daughter. How long did that house last? Not very long. I love this because you can see the children. This is 17 years later or so, and there are the children marveling over this house being destroyed before their eyes so very quickly. There we go. The last of the anchor houses. This is the Cook House on 78th Street. He bought the whole block, built this indestructible house. 15 years later, it is there you go, Institute of Fine Arts, or the James Middle Duke House. So you can see how long this works, but it was the same idea, that he's going to bring people up to his house, buy his house, and then his house gets smashed. Okay, we're going to go by. This is his property, but this is the house that brings the chateau of Alva Vanderbilt forward to the likes of the Warburgs and the Schiffs. This is what happens to the brownstones. If you've ever wondered what's going on in the embassies just off Fifth Avenue in the 70s, it's this. They were brownstones. They take off the door, they take off the detail, they make holes in the middle of it, go back into the yard and refront it with the Beaux-Arts facades that we see there today. So they just eviscerated, changed the brownstone. Then we go up to Mr. Carnegie. Mr. Carnegie and Frick were in rivalry with each other. Each wanted a big area of garden. Mr. Carnegie got it. See it here. And then the Schiff Warburg story is this. This is the Jewish Museum. Frieda Schiff wanted the house, as we saw on 79th Street. Her father didn't like this. He thought it was too showy and it was going to cast the family in a bad air, but eventually he did relate. So this is the Warburg Mansion, which you all may know as the Jewish Museum today, one of the few surviving houses on Fifth Avenue. And this is the last of them. This is Willard Straight's house. Willard Straight married Whitney, daughter. He was a very interesting guy, not to the manner born. He was brought up by missionary parents in Asia, which means he had languages and knowledge of Asia at a time when Americans didn't. And so he was really on his way to becoming a stunning American figure in diplomacy and government circles with her money and his acumen. Everything was going to be wonderful. And we sent him over to Paris in 1918 to sign the treaties with the end of World War I, and he got the Spanish flu. And that was the end of him. That's the end of the story. So basically what happens is that kids are in Europe, the grandchildren are in Europe. New York City's houses cost money. We're beginning to have trouble with the immigrants. We're not sure about the staff. People are robbing us. And so New York City kind of goes away. People don't need that house anymore. The house established you as a reputable businessman in the first part of the 19th century. Now, you're corporate. You've sold out. J.P. Morgan has changed your business and turned it into a stock-bearing corporation. You don't need the assertion of yourself that your house was. Does that make sense to everybody? And so the houses went down without a tear. I only wish the Havemeyer, the Petit Chateau, and the William Collins Whitney house had survived, but we didn't allow that to happen. Thank you for your patience.
Hi, I thought this was fabulous, and I only have one question because we live on the west side, and I've recently read a book about Hannah Elias having a brownstone over there. What was going on over on Central Park West?
Well, lots of problems in Central Park West. In one of Edith Wharton's main novels, the family that comes from the Midwest with a lot of money, and the daughter wants to be in society, and he gets a row house on the west side. And she said, no, I don't want that. Everything's got to be near Fifth Avenue. The Upper West Side, they played real estate games. You know, we looked at the pictures of the houses that had the hoardings in front of them on Fifth Avenue. They had a big problem with that on the west side, especially in Central Park West. Lots of people were gouging for the property, much more than anything you built on it could possibly be worth. And so West End, the only way it could work on Central Park West was multiple dwelling units. Multiple dwelling units are abandoned from 1885 till 1903. You couldn't build an apartment house big enough to make up for the amount of money you spent on the property. So it doesn't develop till that time period when they can do that. And then it takes off.
I was curious how far up this Fifth Avenue had gone by the time Central Park was established.
It doesn't hit Central Park, let's see if I can do it. It doesn't hit Central Park for a very long time. It doesn't hit Central Park. I went over it because I was going too fast, but it's in 1863. Jacob Ray Mould, who did the structures in Central Park built this funny little house for a member of the committee of Central Park Conservancy. Oops.
Sorry. Actually, then we can switch that back so easily.
Okay, he built. There was a little. I didn't talk about it because I knew I was beginning to run over time. There's a very little narrow house with a Gothic window. That's the first house. It was in the middle of the block, the cheapest lots. If you had money and you had ambition, the middle of the block is where you went because it's the smallest and the cheapest lot. So on that site, he built the house, but the problem was it wasn't protected because there was nothing else on either side, and there was a huge windstorm. And that house is pretty much ruined by the windstorm. We then do get speculative builders. The Jabez Bostic house goes in there, partners of Standard Oil, and that is the first house built across the street from the park. But you only get, if you go across the street from the park, you only get half the number of row houses because the park is now taking up the other half.
When was Museum Row created on Fifth Avenue? When did
much later.
Much
Yeah.
later.
Partially because of the people leaving. You know, the Schiffs stayed in the house for a long, Warburgs, they were now Warburgs, but they stayed in that house a long time. So several of the houses did survive the 1950s when the Fifth Avenue went down rather like when you set up a domino game and you work on the setup for a very long time and then you push it. That's the way Fifth Avenue looked in the 1920s. Just thud, 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 thud. And the buildings that survived did thud, thud, thud in the 50s. So at that point, we end up with Museum Row.
With all of the destruction, was
Yeah.
there any kind of small industry amongst builders to take those pieces and incorporate them into new buildings?
It did happen. And I think a lot of the way it happened was giving away to the servants property. There's a very famous story about a St. Gaudens piece. I went over it very quickly. I didn't stop on it in this lecture, but the St. Gaudens fireplace and interior for the Cornelius Vanderbilt house on 57th Street ended up at an auction where somebody saw it in Paris. So a lot of people, I think, gave stuff to the servants. The taste changed. So I was asking about the tapestries that Candace Thurber Wheeler did for this room, and they seem to have been gone by 1900. By 1900, McKim Mead White, who'd been working in this room 20 years earlier, when asked by President Roosevelt about the White House and the interiors and the Tiffany screen in the White House in 1903, when the president asked McKim what he should do about it, McKim said, dynamite. So the taste changed so quickly. I mean, that's why this place is a miracle.
I'll actually add to that. Interestingly, we have a painting on the staircase that's out here when you go out. It's a massive painting of a French battlefield, but it was out of that Vanderbilt house on 58. When they were tearing that
Yes.
down, they were looking, and this was the only space big
enough for it.
painting, and so some of that stuff was coming into places like this, into civic institutions.
That's wonderful.
around.
That's why, because the Vanderbilts did buy from the Stewart sale, when Mrs. Stewart finally bit the dust in 1886, the Vanderbilts bought some of the best paintings that are in the Met today for the Met. And thank goodness the Vanderbilts also gave a lot of good things to the Met. So we owe them, as we owe Louisine Havemeyer, a great debt for the fine pictures we have there. But I didn't know about that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's funny because actually it hung on that wall from 1906 on. And about 10 years ago, we took it down, and the only piece of the original wallpaper was behind that.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Had it not been there, they would have ripped off
That's
the
true.
wallpaper, and we wouldn't have been able to create this. So we owe it to the Vanderbilt's painting.
Yes, they were very good about that. People were giving away. This was still the time when people gave away a lot of these things rather than sell them. That'll change. But it was really the reason that the Metropolitan has as many great pictures as it does.
Was the Pier and the Plaza were they always hotels?
Yes, the Plaza's there's so many crooked real estate stories in this tale. The Plaza Hotel and the square behind, or the square in front of the Plaza Hotel was part of a very peculiar real estate two men who were cooks. And in the end, they tried to build something. They defaulted. New York Life had the first mortgage, or the second mortgage rather. And so when they defaulted, they built Plaza One and Plaza Hotel One. It's in the stupid book. That was a McKinney and White redoing of the very ugly building those two crooks had built, with an interior by Jacob Morel Wells, who I consider McKinney and White, the best talent they ever had, and this wonderful room. But when the debt of that time period was over, I think 1905, in 1907, New York Life brings in Henry Hardenberg, and they tear down the old plaza and do the new plaza. So what the Plaza Hotel did, the first one, the McKinney and White did, the hotels were the Fifth Avenue Hotel, 23rd Street, then the Waldorf Astoria on 34th Street, which is the first place where you could go to dinner if you were a woman. And then the Plaza. That's where the main hotels were for the city at that time. Does that make sense to you? There's pictures of the old Plaza in the work. The book, the Fifth Avenue book.
All the grand apartment buildings in Fifth Avenue were all built more or less in the 20s.
In the 20s. J.R.E. Carpenter. There was a society guy who built those apartment houses. They were the original stories of getting, 1916 is the first one. It's a real problem. How do you protect yourself from, the Astors and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers were really, really worried about the office buildings on the other side of Fifth Avenue, which were going to be 8 or 9 stories, and they would cast shadows. What nobody figured on were the apartment houses. And the Phipps house, the wonderful Phipps house that was the shortest lived of almost any of them, he bought the property around him on Fifth Avenue. He protected himself. The apartment house was on Madison. So they got caught very quickly. And then in comes this law case. It goes to the Supreme Court. And then this society-related architect, Carpenter, does most of the demolition of the 20s. Tearing down those row houses because there's just nothing left. Many of the people were elderly. Many of them, as I said before, the companies are now stock companies. So it's not their image anymore. And so they all go down.
Well, thank you so much.